NATO is celebrating its 70th anniversary this week in London at a two-day meeting that wraps up on Wednesday. But what has been the West's most important military alliance is being tested by deepening cracks in the 29-member bloc. One such issue is how to engage with China, which is investing in more and more projects in Europe. What new questions does China's growth pose for NATO, and how relevant is NATO today? In the Beijing studio, I'm pleased to have Professor Zhang Junshe, Senior Researcher at the Naval Research Academy, and Professor Alexander Lukin, Head of the Department of International Relations at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Russia. And from Washington, D.C., we have Dr. Richard Weitz, a security expert at Wikistrat Global Consultancy. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First of all, let's go straight to look at the relationship between NATO and China. And of course, China is not a member of the NATO. Gentlemen, I'm here. But China is becoming more and more involved in projects beyond Asia, especially in Europe, beyond the Belt and Road, under the Belt and Road Initiative. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Monday said to American TV that we have to address the fact that China is becoming closer to us, investing heavily in the infrastructure. So, Professor Zhang, what do you think are the new questions that China's emergence is posing to NATO?
Well, I don't think China's growth or emergence has brought about any challenges or questioning problems to NATO. I just think that China's growth has brought about opportunities to NATO development.
Why you don't think it? Because obviously from here, for instance, the interview he did, he says there is no way that NATO will move into the South China Sea, but we have to address the fact that China is coming closer to us, investing heavily in infrastructure. We see them in Africa, we see them in Arctic, we see them in cyberspace, and China now has the second largest defense budget in the world, all by Mr. Stoltenberg. It seems that he's perceiving some kind of potential threat or challenge from China.
Well, first, on the defense front, I think China has adopted a national defense policy with a defensive in nature and an active defense military strategy. China will never seek military expansion, nor will China launch any aggression in Europe. So, from the military point, I don't see any challenge or threat that China can pose to NATO. Or talking about the military expenditure, I think China's military expenditure compared with China, or when we think about China's population of 1.3 billion people and a coastline of 18,000 kilometers, I think the China's defense spending is moderate. And also we should notice the percentage of Chinese defense spending in its GDP is below 1.3%. It is much lower than the average percentage of other countries. Now we can see the members of NATO will reach the minimum 2% of the GDP. It's much higher than China's expenditure.
Professor Lukin, how do you see anything wrong with Mr. Stoltenberg's logic here? Because he thinks that China is investing heavily in infrastructure or projects in Europe, therefore, you know, it seems to pose a threat to NATO. Do you see a coherence here, or do you think he could have a certain elements of relevance there?
Of course, there's a contradiction, because NATO, to quote President Trump, is obsolete. It's an organization which was created to address the expansion of the Soviet bloc, but there is no Soviet bloc for almost 30 years, and NATO is still there. So it's a very strange organization which didn't have a purpose for a long time. Now they're looking for purpose of their existence, and they found Russia and China as threats, and they're very happy about it. You know, when I was at Oxford University, together with Richard, by the way, I managed to visit NATO headquarters as part of a group of Oxford University several times. And you know, it's a big building there, and there is a in Brussels, and there are hundreds of people working there from every country, and they have a lot of restaurants, facilities, even a travel agency inside for their own purposes. So I understood very well that they're never going to dissolve themselves because it's very comfortable. So they need to find some kind of pretext that they should exist.
You make it somehow sound very funny, but it is kind of funny. Let me go to Mr. Dr. Weitz in Washington, D.C. and hear his insight. Richard there. So Professor Lukin just now mentioned you as well. So what is your take on the situation? Why do you think Mr. Stoltenberg is hinting that China's expansion in Europe could pose some kind of challenge to the NATO? Does it really, according to you?
Well, I think he explained it well recently, in which he said that it's not that NATO wants to move militarily into, for example, the South China Sea. It's that China is becoming a very powerful global actor, and the kind of issues that NATO is concerned with, cybersecurity, the Arctic, Africa, and so on, China is invariably a major factor in all these issues, so the alliance needs to develop a policy. And he explicitly said that China, it's a challenge in some of these areas, but an opportunity in others. I know that the NATO tried to work with earlier with China and Afghanistan, and that didn't work out too well. But now I think it's a good opportunity to put the relationship on a more solid, comprehensive basis.
So basically, Richard, they're saying, they're not just looking for a purpose to exist for the sake of keeping themselves employed, basically. And as Mr. Stoltenberg said here, and I quoted, we see the Europeans see Chinese in the Arctic, we see them in cyberspace, and so on and so forth. Professor Lukin, how do you react to that?
Well, generally we can understand that, well, let's think about what NATO is. NATO is a transatlantic alliance, but it sees itself as a global organization which is somehow in charge of security all over the world. And if we translate it to a normal language, this means that it's a tool of Western global domination. They see themselves like that, because theoretically, Arctic is not their area. China is very far from their area. Africa has nothing to do with NATO, according to their charter. But they see themselves as such kind of military tool of Western domination. And from that point of view, of course, they're unhappy of having in the world other big countries which do not, either not a member of NATO or are not kind of dominated by NATO. And Russia, China, perhaps several other countries are good examples. If they have a challenge, not a military challenge from China, but kind of ideological challenge or, civilizational challenge, they see it as a threat. It's like if I'm rich and my neighbor is getting richer. We say in Russia there are two options, either to put my neighbors on fire or to become rich myself. So they would like to put everyone on fire, I think.
Okay, Richard, your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, NATO is involved with, for example, countering extremism and terrorism in Africa. China has not a military presence in the Arctic, but it's certainly playing a major role in working with Russia to develop the Northern Sea route and exploit some of the Arctic resources. And infrastructure, China's got we know has now building up a presence in Greenland, some of the European ports. So I think it's very understandable that NATO wants to think about, what does this mean? Is this potentially a threat? How do we counter it? Is it an opportunity? How do we develop it? And so on. So I don't think this is unreasonable on the part of the alliance. And the U.S. has been pushing this a while, and other countries have now joined in. So I fully understand what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Professor Zhang, your reaction, please.
Well, I think NATO now is being misled by the United States. We know that the United States has labeled China as a strategic competitor, and it is because of the U.S. clamoring. Now NATO has, for the first time, labeled China as a challenge to NATO, but it is not true. Just for the economic investment. I think this investment in infrastructure has brought about opportunities to these countries, including countries in the Eastern and Southern Europe and other countries along the Belt and Road. And all the countries are welcoming China's investment. I think it is the United States actually is smearing China. The debt crisis or just the cyber attack, they're just smearing or defaming China. They have never put forward any evidence.
All right, I'm still going to give the opportunity to Mr. Weitz there to have his argument. Richard.
Yeah, so it's true that the Trump administration has been seeing China in more negative light than previous administrations, but the Europeans, some of them have followed as well. Some of the issues you talked about in the first part of the program, some of the BRI has turned out to be more complicated than they thought. So there are not all European governments, but some of them are also trying to determine what should be the NATO role in China and how to best manage that. And again, China is going to be a global superpower for the foreseeable future. So I think it's important that NATO and the U.S. and the Europeans have some kind of policy towards China, which encompasses security issues, but goes beyond that.
All right, Professor Lukin. If NATO is going down this path, what could be the consequence?
Well, we already have the consequences in Russia. The result of NATO continuous expansion is that first Russia became more anti-Western, because in the 1990s Russian government was rather pro-Western, and it wanted to be a partner, even maybe a junior partner of the West, but at the same time, kind of, as a big country, it wants to be one of those countries which influences the decision. And NATO began its expansion and brought its military facilities to Russia's border. So it influenced the Russian public opinion, and the Russian government became more anti-Western.
All right. Are you potentially saying this could have a similar effect on China? Yes or no?
Well, China already has a government, so it's not going to influence.
the kind of anti-West feeling.
But of course, if the West, the NATO or the United States is going to continue this anti-Chinese policy, of course Chinese public opinion at least will become more anti-West.
All right, we have to leave it there. Many thanks, Professor Alexander Lukin, Professor Zhang Junshe, and Dr. Richard Weitz joining us from Washington, D.C. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.